Hi, my name is Jeffro, and this is Digital Dominance, the podcast for service-based small business owners who are ready to seize the recognition and growth that their company deserves. You've worked hard to build a business you're proud of. Now it's time for Digital Domination. Welcome back to Digital Dominance. As you've probably noticed, our world and our economy continue to become more and more digital. If you don't consider yourself to be tech savvy, then you're probably unhappy or even scared about this. But for many others, going digital is a welcome advancement. But like it or not, the problem that a lot of us now face is how to remain connected and relevant in a digital age. There's so much access to knowledge and entertainment at our fingertips. So how do we cut through the noise and capture attention? Now, in my opinion, a huge part of this boils down to something that many of us have taken for granted, which is communication. We may be great at communicating in person, where we can utilize more than our words to convey a message. Tone, volume, body language are all shaping and enhancing our words. Plus, we get real-time feedback from the body language of the person we're talking to, so we can adapt as we go. But if you're putting up a blog post, all you have is the written word. And if you haven't spent the time to understand how to communicate in a purely written medium, you simply won't be very effective. My guest today is Holly Crawshaw. She's a best-selling ghostwriter and top LinkedIn creator. Holly understands how to communicate a story that captures your voice and engages your audience. Now, if you're looking to communicate on digital platforms in a way that drives business, then you're going to want to pay attention to this episode. So, Holly, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, me too. I've followed your posts on LinkedIn for a while now, and you're very consistent with the value that you bring. Your posts are always helpful and engaging, so thank you for that. But
thank you.
You're an experienced writer. Do the rest of us have any hope of learning to communicate like you do without having all that writing experience?
Listen, one question people ask me is how did you become a writer? And the answer is always disappointing. I sat my bottom down in a chair and I put my fingers on a laptop and I just started typing. And anyone who writes is a writer. I think a lot of people who post on LinkedIn or write blogs or maybe journal wouldn't consider themselves communicators, but that's exactly what they are. Just because you're not getting $1 for your words doesn't make you less of a writer. That's one common myth that I try to dispel often.
Yeah. Well, my brother, it's funny you mentioned that. Like a number of years back, he's a writer and an author. When he was kind of getting started, he at one point sent me a bio to review. He was going to put it on Amazon, his author description. He's like, let me know what you think. And in there he wrote, Wes Fullerton is an aspiring author. And I was like, Wes, you're not aspiring. You've published 3 books. You're an author. Take out that word. And he's like, oh yeah. And so I think we all do that, right? Even authors. So it's a great reminder.
I think another common misconception is that people who have been writing for I've been professionally writing now for 18 years. People assume that it's easy, number one, or that it's still not scary to share. And neither of those are true. It's still work. To me, it's the best kind of work because it's my passion. It's what I think I was wired to do. But it still requires effort. It requires 100% of my brain. It's not something mindless that I do. I really go against the grain when it comes to most writing cliches. I'm the worst cliche. I do not go to coffee shops. I do not smoke cigars in alleys. I am not cool about it at all. I actually have to sit down, get in the right headspace and just write.
Well, I think everybody's going to have their own process, of course. I also think that a lot of us, myself included, we start out by writing posts and emails as if we were writing a mini book report about our business. We all learn to summarize and regurgitate information in school. So that's kind of what we fall back on. So do you have any advice on how to break that habit?
So one of the best ways to get creative is to simply tell a story. And you might say, I don't have any good stories, or my story's down, or everybody's heard my story. That's not true. What's true is that you are the only one who can share your story. And I'm not just talking about your life story, but we have professional stories. We have relationship stories. We have stories about fears. We have stories about dreams. All of those are examples of stories. And so to get sort of out of that regurgitation habit, which now AI will do for us. So to step outside of that sort of essay writing, book report sort of style of writing, I would start by sharing a story, just one story. It can be simple. It can be your first day of school. It can be anything, but starting to tell stories is the way to stir creativity. And it's also the best way to connect to other people.
Well, I imagine that's why you called your business Story Spark, right? Because that's the thing that sparks the communication, the message that you're trying to find. I also think it's natural for people to think that other people have more interesting stories than we do. Do you find that to be true also?
Everyone thinks that their story is, so you have two groups of people. You have the group of people who think that their story is absolutely incredible and that it can't be topped. And then you have the group of people who absolutely do not want to write their own story because they think it's boring and bland. But what I find in this niche of people, and these are my favorite people to work with as a ghostwriter, is that when you really start digging down and asking questions, these are some of the most interesting, these are typically introverts or mostly introverted people. When you start digging down and asking them their stories and asking them their ideas and their thoughts and their observations about the world around them, it's incredibly fascinating. Stories don't just have to be one time this thing happened. Stories can also be, I have this philosophy, I have this principle, I have these values, or I have these theories. So when you tell yourself you don't have a story, that is legitimately a lie, because I know you have thoughts in your head. And if you would just sit down and write them, and you don't even have to share them publicly. And that's one thing that I would encourage people who are hesitant to start posting or start sharing digitally, I encourage them to sit down and just write something that you don't share with anybody and just sit with it, because you don't have to just rip the Band-Aid off and pour your guts out on LinkedIn. I definitely don't recommend that. Start small. Start by writing one story down. Don't share it with anyone. Then maybe write another story. Maybe share it with a friend. You know, you can take baby steps to sharing if you're scared to share.
Yeah. And I think it's a good point to remember your story doesn't have to be dramatic to be worth sharing. There's lots of different types of stories. But it is, when I was thinking about this for the episode, I was thinking back to how maybe a lot of us got to this point. I know for me, as an example, growing up in church, you'd occasionally hear someone share their testimony about what God has done for them. You know, the church brings in guest speakers. They talk about how they were in a gang, they killed people, got shot in a drive-by, and then they had an angel appear to them in a dream, and God turned their life around in an instant. So then as a person in the audience, when it's my turn to share a testimony in small group, I'm like embarrassed because I'm like, well, I was raised a Christian since I was 4. Then I followed all the rules my whole life, and here I am. And like that, the gang story might convert people. My story won't. And I think a lot of us carry that same kind of feeling of embarrassment or comparison when we talk about our business or our job as well. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So I grew up in church as well. I actually started writing in the church space, and that's where I worked at a church. I worked at a mega church for 10 years. I don't know if you knew that. But I worked at a mega church for 10 years. And one thing I learned about every single person who walked in the door is that they brought with them past experiences, and they brought with them their own, when you say the word testimony, their own experience with God. And when you think about it, we all have our own experiences with work. We all have our own experiences with relationships. We all have our own experiences with all sorts of entities in our lives. It's not just about sharing your testimony, which I loved it in prayer meeting when they would be like, have an unspoken prayer request. And you're like, ooh, like so curious.
Drama.
Yeah, for sure. But, if you start comparing yourself to others, period, on any level, it's just unhealthy. I always call that the comparison trap. Nobody wins. So comparing your story to someone else's, you're not going to win. They're not going to win. And it's not really a competition.
Yeah, it's not. Well, and so here's kind of the next question to that, right? It's good to start telling your stories. How do you help people tell their story in a compelling way? Because there's a difference. So
there's a couple of different things I share about telling your story. And one is that you don't have to go all the way. One way I frame it is I say, okay, if you're thinking of a news article, if you're trying to be vulnerable, right, for the first time and share your story online and publicly, if you think of your story as a news article, I would only share the headline and maybe the subcopy, but you don't have to go into that detailed text. You can simply share just the main ideas. You don't have to go into detail. But one of the most effective and compelling ways to share your story is to do that and then immediately turn and pivot that story and put it in the reader's lap and say, hey, have you had this experience? What do you think about this experience? How have you applied these principles, or how have you gotten out of this situation? So you share the headline, maybe a little bit of that subtitle. You don't have to go into the copy. You don't need to bleed on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
In fact, you shouldn't. But immediately making it matter to the reader by asking them questions and inviting them in on your journey.
So that kind of segues into the question that I'm sure a lot of listeners are waiting for, is how do you then use your story to get leads for your business? How do you connect it without it feeling like a forced, bait and switch type of thing? Like, and now buy my stuff, how do you do that?
So the very best way to do that is to simply share social proof. And by social proof, I mean, just talk about how you've helped people in the past. And I know a lot of people are going to push back on that and say, I don't want to brag. I don't want to brag. I don't want to brag. It's not bragging, because you can't help more people unless you talk about how you've already helped people. And so I always say, start by sharing social proof, or just talk about a part of your industry that's interesting to the masses. Maybe some statistics, some data, some interesting facts. Share some stories of some interactions with clients or interactions with your teammates. Sharing stories about your business, whether it's social proof or whether it's simply, hey, here's what's going on and here's what's new, that attracts people, because people become interested in what you're telling, and people become a destination for interesting and entertaining information. I always say all stories should be either encouraging, entertaining, or educational. And if you can mark one of those three boxes, heck, if you can mark all three, it's a home run. But if you can just mark one of those boxes, people are going to start coming and looking at what you're doing and looking at what you're saying, because readers are selfish. Heck, I'm a selfish reader. I'm not going to come to a page that's just telling me basic information. I want to hear stories. I want to see examples. I want to be entertained, encouraged, or educated.
Can you give us an example of maybe, a post that you've written for yourself that's done that well, or someone else on LinkedIn that you see doing that?
Telling stories well?
Yeah, and connecting it to business especially.
So this is interesting. So this is also going to be an example of how to share a vulnerable story well.
All right.
So I grew up very poor. I grew up basically in poverty, on food stamps, no money whatsoever. My parents had a horrible divorce, and I ended up living with my dad for most of my life. And I watched my dad start a landscaping company, and he would come home and he would say, Holly, if I can make $150 a day, I can pay all of the bills. And so I would watch, he had this truck that you had to steer all the way to the left to make it go straight. And he would put a push mower on the back of that truck. And he would just go knock on people's doors and say, hey, can I cut your grass? Hey, can I cut your grass? Hey, can I cut your grass? And that was back in 1992. And I've watched him scale that business. And now in 2024, he is the premier landscaper for major businesses in our area, and he plays golf all day and has a team of 25 people. And it all started with a truck and a push mower. So I tell that story on LinkedIn, and I talk about all the things I watched my dad do well that I want to do in my own business. And so the inference is, if you work with this girl, these are the values that you're getting. This is the experience that you're getting. She's watched it go from 0 to 100.
Yeah, well, and I like that it also sets realistic expectations because people so often hear marketing hype, right, of the promises of how much I'm going to get you. But you're just showing like, look, this is where I come from, my background, work ethic. And so if you connect with that, then I'm going to want to hire you, right, and work with you as opposed to somebody else.
Absolutely. That post, I share that post about once every 3 or 4 months, and it always it's my highest impression post, my highest engagement post. And I think it's just because people are so used to the garbage, to the sort of overnight success stories. People have become immune to that because it's just not relatable. And so when you hear a real life success story like that, and you see the hard work and dedication that went into it, you're like, no, that's real. And people relate to authenticity and they connect and respond to authenticity.
Let me ask you a question about reposting the same story. Do you rewrite it each time, or is it
That's
the
a great
same
question.
copy paste?
So I have a content system, and this is something I teach in my masterclass, but it's an iteration concept, and it's basically a way to rank your posts. You rank the top 5 by comments, top 5 by impressions, and top 5 by engagement. And you put those posts every 6 months, you put those in a box. You could probably, if you're just starting, do that every 30 days. But now that I've been writing on LinkedIn for literally ever, I do it about every 6 months. And I grab those posts and I say, there was something about this post that was magic. And I'm always looking to recreate magic with content. And so when I tell people how to iterate content, I simply say, look at those posts. I will always change the attachment and I will always change the hook, but the meat mostly stays the same, or the body of the post mostly stays the same, but it's very small tweaks. But if you don't learn how to iterate on LinkedIn, if you don't learn how to reuse content and recycle, like I did, how to identify which content to recycle, and then learn how to recycle it in a way that makes it still feel fresh. Like, I don't want to serve my audience leftovers. I really want it to feel like a brand new dinner. I have to figure out a way to make it feel incredibly fresh with as little effort as possible. And if you don't know how to do that and you don't learn how to do that, you will burn out because it is just a grind.
Well, and I like that too, because I think a lot of people are always worried about, what if I run out of ideas? Like, well, you can reuse the best ones, and that's okay because of the way the feeds work. Not everybody saw it last time. And if you wait long enough, they may forget about it, or they may be pleasantly reminded about it if they enjoyed it the first time.
I'll be honest with you. I have about 50 posts that I write over and over again at this point. I've been doing this for 3 years. I've identified like these 50 posts that do well. And when I talk about posts, like, this sounds really overwhelming. These come from content buckets. So I write about 3 different things and I call those my content buckets. And so I pull an idea out of each bucket, and everybody has to identify their content buckets for themselves. There are some very general ones that work very well, but you don't have to come up with a new idea every day. And especially if you can identify, okay, these are the 3 things I talk about. I talk about marketing, branding, and audience building. So if you can figure out what those 3 buckets are, that really guides and steers your content creation process and takes a lot of the pressure off of you. And within those buckets, there are different stories that stick in each bucket, and there are different social proofs that stick in each bucket. And so that's how I iterate content over time, and how I come up with content ideas is but look, when I started on LinkedIn, I sucked. I was really bad. I was really, really bad at LinkedIn for at least 2 years. So the whole world should know that it was not an overnight success for me either. But I learned in time what my audience responded to. And I think a lot of people give up because they put a lot of stuff out on LinkedIn and they're not getting any responses. But the truth is that you have to keep going. You have to try something different. You have to wait and see what your audience responds to, and then again, recreate that magic.
I like that. And do you ever use AI to help you come up with content ideas, or do you recommend that clients do that if they feel stuck?
So the best way for me, so first of all, please do not use AI to write a post, because it is glaringly obvious. If I see you talk about navigating a journey, I know you've been on AI. I know you've been on AI. I like to use it to say, so there's one creator, Luke Matthews, who's incredible. He would be the go-to source to figure out how best to use AI to create content. But the way I use it is I'll say, give me 10 topics on audience growth that CEOs over 40 who make over 6 figures would find interesting. So I'll use it just to get very specific. If I'm really targeting a certain audience on a post, I'll use it to help me come up with ideas. I really use it as a thesaurus. It is the best thesaurus out there. Like, what's a better way to say stupid? What's a more intelligent word for beautiful? I use it a lot that way too for word choice.
Got it. So ideation and kind of as a helpful editor friend to run stuff by. I like it. So I have another question here, because obviously this is important and helpful, but who does it really apply to? Who should focus on learning to tell their story? Is it only solopreneurs? Is it better for certain industries? I mean, should everybody do this?
I have had clients who owned landscaping companies. I have a client who's an arborist. I have a client who owns several law firms. I believe it's important for everybody to create a brand. The best brands are all online, and they're all creating their digital footprint, because nowadays that's the best marketing. It's better than commercials. It's better than anything else you can do, is to create an online presence and to create a brand so that people understand who you are and what you're about, and they associate you with certain ideas. But I think everybody should tell their story, and not just because it benefits me, and not just because I'm a storyteller and I love stories, but because I've seen the power of how it fuels businesses and fuels leads when people feel like they know you. If people feel like they know you, then they can begin to like you, then they begin to trust you, and then and only then will they buy from you.
And I love that you just kind of implicitly connected writing stories to branding. And for the audience, I want you guys to catch this. Your brand is more than just the logo and colors. It's the stories that go along with it, the beliefs that people have about you and your company. And so this
Absolutely.
is a great way to kind of cultivate that as you choose which stories to tell and how you tell them.
Absolutely.
Last question before we wrap up here. Are there any common mistakes you see people making as they're learning to tell their story?
I think the only mistake you can make is to not do it. I truly believe that, because you're never going to get better unless you try and unless you actually put your story out there. And trust me, no one's thinking about your story by the time lunchtime hits. If you post at 9 a.m. in the golden hour, nobody's thinking about it by the middle of the day. I think the biggest mistake you can make is to let the fear of what might happen be bigger than the fear of what's possible for you and your business, and to not share your story at all.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. No excuses, guys. You got to start. Well, Holly, thanks so much for being here today. I keep coming back to this concept of storytelling and communication on the podcast because it underpins so much of the work that we do in order to successfully market our businesses. So for those of you listening, go check out Holly's website. Go follow her on LinkedIn. Check out her masterclass. You'll get lots of nuggets from her posts if you follow her. And Holly, can you leave us with, do you have a favorite book project that you worked on?
My favorite book project of all time, this is super random, but it was for a man named Jack Penrod, and he built the Nikki Beach brand. And he was the most fascinating individual I've ever met. His book is One Grand Adventure. I wrote it a long time ago. It was a legacy piece. He wanted to write it for his family. It wasn't even a commercial book. But he was the most fascinating man I have ever met, because he got a job when he was 4 years old, scraping tins at a bakery. And now he's a multi-billionaire. So he's an incredible man. That was a super fun project. And I really loved his story and his wife and his family, and he was just an incredible person.
That sounds really intriguing. Now I'm really curious. But thanks again for being here, Holly. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. Remember, your story matters. You need to tell it well. So take care. We'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Digital Dominance Podcast. This show is brought to you by FroBro.com. If you are a B2B service provider and you're ready to transform your website into a high-converting, lead-generating sales tool, go to FroBro.com/revive to learn more.